Hello everyone, I'm Armela and in this video we're going to talk about functions in Python. Now, we might have seen the term functions so far without knowing what they are. Well, in this video we will look into functions in detail. We will discuss why they're so necessary and of course we're going to learn how we can write our own functions and how to use them in our programs. So let's go. First, the definition. What is a function? A function is considered a named section of a program that performs a specific task. So basically, a function is just some lines of code that we give a name to. We give a name to so that we can access them whenever we want. And these lines of code perform a specific task or solve a sub-problem. Basically, they do something for us, okay? Okay, now that we got the idea of what a function is, why do we need to use these functions? Well, let's consider a scenario where we're working for our own project. It is a big project, it is a large program, and we need to repeat the same task several times. Is it efficient for us if we repeat the same lines of code again and again from scratch? Well, of course it isn't, and that's when functions will come in handy. That's when we need to use functions. By using functions, we need only to write the function once, and then we can reuse it anytime that we want. In this way, we remove redundancy, we save time, and we make our programs shorter. Also, by separating the whole program into smaller pieces, this improves the readability of our code. What do we mean by this? By improving the readability, it means that our code becomes more structured and it's easier for us and for other programmers to understand what's happening. Okay? Also, by using functions, we are making our programs easier to debug and to catch errors because it is easier for us to locate where and why an error is happening. Okay, now that we got the idea of why it's beneficial for a programmer to use functions, let's dive into how we can write our function. Okay, but first, I want to remind you some of the functions that we may have seen and used so far. Do you recall this line here that we use to get the input from the user? Well, this is actually a function, and it does something for us. It gets the input from the user, so that is its task. Also, we already know the print function, which displays something on the console, or the len function, which calculates the length of the string that is given inside its parentheses. And lately, you've become familiar with list functions like append and pop, which respectively add an element to the list or remove an element from the list. Okay. We have called these functions, we have used them without actually caring what was happening in the background or how they were being implemented. And these functions that we have used so far are called built-in functions. They are already built. They're in the Python libraries and we have only used them. But now we will see how we can write our own functions according to our needs. In order to do so, we need to understand or we need to know what is the syntax or the structure of a function. Basically, each function starts with a def keyword. This def here stands for define. So basically, we're defining our function. After def, we have the name of the function. It is advised that this function name is something related to what our function does, okay? And after the function name, we have this parenthesis, and these parentheses are always mandatory. Inside the parentheses, we can see here that we have a parameter list, and it is optional, so let's not worry about this in this moment. Just remember the def keyword, the name, and the mandatory parentheses, okay? After the parentheses, we need the column, just like we used in the for loop, in a while loop, or in the if conditions, okay? And all the statements which are under the function definition and which are indented are a part of the function body. So basically, the code that goes in here is the code that performs the task of the function. Okay, now that we understood which is the syntax or the structure of a function, let's go on to write our first function in Python. Just let me switch the screen. Okay. Okay, we will keep it really simple, and our first exercise is going to be just write a function that prints a greeting on the screen, okay? So greeting. Now, in order to write this function, we need, as we said, the def keyword, and then we need to specify the name of the function. Since this function is greeting, let's call it like greet, for example. And then we need the parentheses and of course a column. Let's press enter, and here we can write our greeting statements, for example, hello. And after that, we can write, for example, welcome to functions in Python. It doesn't really matter, okay? It's just a simple example. Okay, so basically this is our function. Now let's try to run this. Okay, nothing is happening. Why is that so? Well, we wrote our function and our function is ready to use, but we didn't call it. Unless we call a function, it won't execute, okay? So in order for the function to perform its task, it must be executed. And whenever we need to execute a function, we just simply need to call it. How to call this function? Just specify the name of the function and then the parentheses, and that's it. Let's press run, and we can see that now we have on the screen, hello and welcome to functions in Python. Okay, now that we finished with our very first simple example, we can continue with something else. Okay, here we have parameters and arguments. Remember just the things that we ignored a little while ago. Okay, it says there that a parameter is a variable in a method definition. So all these variables in here are parameters. They are specified after the function name inside the parentheses, okay? Now, an argument is an input to a function. So the values that we give to these parameters when we call the function are called arguments. Sometimes arguments and parameters are used interchangeably because they are considered to mean the same thing, but it's not a problem. Okay, we have another line here that says that by default, parameters have a positional behavior. What do we mean by this? Well, let's go on with our second. Of course, it will also be an easy exercise, but let's go on with our second exercise and we will discuss everything, okay? Let's remove the first one that we had. And in the second exercise, we are going to calculate the mth power of n. Basically, just n to the power m. Okay, in Python, this is really easy since we already have the power or exponential operator, okay? And to write a function, we need the def keyword, as we said. Let's call the function pow, since it will calculate the power of the number. And then we need to put in here the parameters of our function. What will be the inputs to our function? Well, it will be n and it will be m, okay? And then we put the colon, we press enter, and in here, we can say, for example, that our result will be equal to n to the power m. And then in our function, we just need to print this result, okay? Now, how to call this function? We will proceed in the same way as we did before. We will specify the name of the function, and in here, we need to pass the arguments. As arguments, we can use numbers, we can use variables, as long as they have been initialized, or we can use expressions, okay? Let's use, for example, 3 and 2. And these are the arguments, and each argument corresponds to the parameter in the function definition, okay? Let's run this to see the result, and the result is 9. Why it is 9? Well, because 3 is mapped to n, or 3 is passed to n will be 3, and m will be 2. And the result will be 3 to the power 2, which is 9, and that's why we have a 9 in here. Okay, now, what would happen if we would have called the function with the same arguments, so 3 and 2, but we would have put them like 2 and 3. What will be the result? Let's run it. Oh, as we see here, the result is 8. That's because now 2 will be passed to n and 3 will be passed to m. So basically, the arguments are passed into the function or are mapped into these parameters in the order that they are written. So that's what we mean by positional arguments. So the position in which we enter the arguments is really important. 2 will be mapped to n and 3 will be mapped to m, okay? And the result will be 8. Now, this means that each time that we pass arguments, we need to remember the order in which the arguments were specified in the function definition, okay? But Python is flexible and it allows us to do something like this. For example, we can specify that m can be 2 and n can be 3. Now, even though we are passing as the first argument 2, so supposedly 2 would be mapped to n, we are specifying with this key value syntax that m should be 2. See, when I select m here is highlighted. So m will be 2, and we're specifying n to be 3. And because of this, if we run, the result would be the same as in the first case where n was 3 and m was 2, okay? So the result would be 9. Okay, another thing that I want you to know is that if we call a function with more or less number of arguments that they are already defined, then we would get an error. For example, if we call this function pow with only one argument and they run it, we will get the error pow is missing one required positional argument m. So it is basically missing m. And if we run it with more arguments that are already defined, we'll also get an error because it would say that pow, our function, takes 2 positional arguments, but we gave the function 5 arguments, okay? Another thing that we may want to consider is if we call this function with, for example, 2 strings, like a and b, what would happen? Well, let me remove this here. Let's run it again. Oh, an error again. It says unsupported operand types for this power operator, okay? Well, this is because I guess it's quite understandable. A is passed to n and b is passed to m. So basically we are raising a to the power of b, which does not make any sense. So in order for us to use a function, we should know, it is important for us to know how many arguments does the function have, what does this function do, and what type of arguments can we pass into this function. So it is a good programming practice that if we put here a comment like a docstring to say that what this function does, so basically this function raises n to power of m, and what are the, and what are the inputs to this function? So n is the base and m, for example, is the power or the exponent, okay? And this is a great programming practice, so because it helps you to understand how and to remember how the programs that you have written are working. Okay, now let's go on with something else. Okay, we already discussed keyword arguments, which use the key value syntax, and here is another simple example. Let's go on with another thing, which are default arguments. What are default arguments? Well, by the name, default arguments are arguments which have a default value. And if the caller decides to call the function without specifying a value for this argument, then it will use the default value. In here, we have an example. We have a function which is called country, and it has one argument, which is the default argument. And its default value is Albania. And what we do inside this function, we simply print IM from plus the argument. Now, if we decide to call the function and we specify a string as a value for the default argument, then this value in here, which is Italy, will replace the default value and will be used inside the function. And the result will be I am from Italy, as we can see. If we call the function without specifying any argument, then it will use the default value that we've given to this argument, and the result will be I am from Albania. And in the third case, just like in the first case, this value here will replace the default value, and the result will be I am from USA. Okay. Now, something else to know about default arguments is that default arguments need to always come at the end of the function definition, after all non-default arguments. Okay, here we have another example in which we multiply a string by a value, and the string is required positional argument, so it is not a default argument, but n is the default argument, and its default value is 1. And inside the function, we just print the string multiplied by n. Now, if we decide to call the function while specifying a value for n, this value will replace the value 1, and the string will be multiplied by 5, and the result will be this string right here, which is 5 times high, okay? And if we decide to call the function without specifying a value for the default argument, it will use the default value, and the result will be just high. I guess is quite understandable. Now, let's continue with something else which is really important. Return values. What are return values? Well, if we go back to the functions that we have written so far, we have only printed results inside the function. We did not return something to the caller, so back to where we were calling this function. But most of the functions will take arguments, we'll perform some calculations, and then we would need to return a value to the caller. And this value is known as a return value. How can we return a value? With the return statement. So return statement is used to send the result of a function back to the caller. We will see an example, but first what we need to know is that a function can have no return values, just like the functions that we've seen so far. For example, remember the pop function, which just printed the value and did not return it to the caller. A function can have a single return value. For example, this function in here, which calculates the square of x, and it basically just returns the value of the square of x. Be careful, these are not two values, this is just only one, because, for example, if x was 3, we would have 3 times 3, 9, so we would return only a single value. Now, another thing that Python allows us to do is to return multiple values, and this can be quite beneficial. In order to return multiple values, we can return them as a tuple, and we need to separate them with a comma. Okay, now let's go on to see an example. Okay, first, let's continue with this power function that we had in here. We need to return the result of this function. So let's make it like a function with a return value. We just use the return keyword and we say return result, okay? Now let's remove this part in here. And let's call this function. Let's call it like pow. And for n, I would give, for example, 4, and for m, I would give 2. Let's run it. See, nothing is happening. Why is that so? Because in this case, we are not printing the value. We are returning the value. But where is this value returned? We need to store the value that is returned into a variable, or we can print it directly, but just let's store it into a variable. I will call the variable a, for example. So a will be equal to the value returned by this function, okay? Now, if we would try to print a, the result would be 4 to the power of 2, which is 16. Okay, now let's write a simple example which returns multiple values. Let's remove this part. Okay, let's write a function which will increment two numbers x and y by a value I, okay? Now, how can we write this function? Well, we just specify the def keyword, and let's call the function increment. And then as arguments or as parameters, we place x and y and I. What we do inside the function is just basically we say x plus equals to I, we increment x by I, and y plus equals to I. And what we do at the end, we need to return these values of x and y. So we say return x, comma, y. Now, how to call this function? Just like we did in the previous example, we need to store values that the function will return into variables. Since here we have two values returned, we can use a and b equals to the name of our function. So we are calling our function and we are placing as values 3, 4, and 5. So basically we're incrementing 3 with 5 and 4 with 5. So the results would be, okay, I forgot to print the results, okay? I can print the results. I can try and only print A, and I will have A as 8 because 3 plus 5 is 8, or I can print them both and have A as 8 and B as 9, okay? Now another thing that probably I forgot to mention is that we could pass values not only as numbers, but we can pass them as variables. For example, I can use, I don't know, k for example, and k I would say that is equal to 700, okay? And maybe I could pass an expression here, which will be 2 times t plus 1, where t is equal to 1. And this will work perfectly fine, okay? The results will be different because of the values that I randomly gave. Okay, now let's remove this example and let's go on with theory. Now that we talked about return values, we will continue with the last part of our function explanation, which are local and global variables. Now, why do we need to talk about variables when we're talking about functions? Well, we will see in a while. Basically, when a variable is defined inside a function, it is called local to that function. So it is a local variable. This means that it does not exist outside the function. So basically, if we try to access that variable outside the function, we will get an error. See here, we have a function called function1 in which we have a for loop and we have the variable I defined in here. This I is a local variable for function1. Now, if we would try to print I outside this function, of course, we would get an error. And here we have another function, which is function2, and we have, again, I in here. Is this the same I as the one that was in here? No, this is another I. This I is local for function2. So this I is different from this I, okay? Even though we call function1 inside the same function, because we can do this, we can call functions inside functions. When we print the value of I, this I will be again the I that is inside function2, because the function2 can only access the value inside it. It cannot access the value I from the other function, okay? Now, let's see an example. Let's have a function that we will call fun1. Let's say I is equal to 50, and we will say for, or better, I is equal to 4, okay? For j in range I, we will just print j. I'm sorry, these examples are really easy, but we're just trying to learn the basics here, okay? Now, if we call this function, we'll get the result 0, 1, 2, 3. Now, what would happen if we would like to access I in here? Let's just say print I. Okay, we have an error. It says name I is not defined. But I've defined I here. Well, this I is local to the function, and outside the function, we cannot access I. It's like it has no life outside the function. It does not exist, okay? Now, How can we access variables inside and outside functions? Well, this comes to the concept of a global variable. Let's just write another example. Suppose that we have a variable here that is x is equal to cake. It is a string. Now let's define our function, again fun1 I'm going to call it, and inside this function I'm going to print I want some plus x. Now if we try and run function1, it will work perfectly fine. It would say I want some cake. This variable x is defined outside the function, and as it is defined outside the function, it is a global variable. As a global variable, it can be accessed inside and outside functions. Okay, let's try to print it in here. Let's print x. We can see that x is printed even if it is accessed outside the function, and even if it is accessed inside the function, and it's concatenated with this other part of the string. Now, how do we define a variable inside the function, but we want it to make it global inside the function? Let's use the same example. To define a variable global inside a function, we need to use the global keyword. Let's say global x, and then we initialize x with cake, and then we print I want some cake. Now, let's try to run this. The result is still the same. In this case, we can access x outside of the function, even though it was defined inside of the function, because we used the keyword global. We made it a global variable. Now, if we had another function, for example, function 2, and we would want to access x, of course we could do so because x is a global variable. Let's make some plus x, and let's run this. Oh, I forgot to call it. So let's call function 2. And we see that all three print statements are executed. Now, that's it for the basic things that you needed to know about functions. I hope you enjoyed this video and you learned something from it. Thank you.